So Paradox has a problem with warfare in Victoria 3. And I'm not just talking about the warfare system that's currently in the game, even though that does have problems in its own right, but the system that is in place is probably one of the better ways Paradox could have portrayed warfare in the Victorian era. And that's where the fundamental problem with warfare in Victoria 3 lies: the Victorian era. A quick disclaimer before I continue. I am not a game developer nor a historian, just a guy with an interest in history and Paradox games. But I've had this topic in my head for a while now, and I wanted to talk about it. As far as I know, I haven't really heard anyone else talk about this specific problem in this manner, but of course I could be wrong. Anyways, on with the video. Now, the Victorian era was a time of change, not only because of the Second Industrial Revolution or the change in the political landscape, but also because of the changes it brought to the way wars were fought. The biggest change being the increase in firepower, mostly as seen in World War I. Because although this can be seen in wars like the Second Schleswig War, the Boer Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, the Crimean War, or the American Civil War, the biggest change came with machine guns, which only started being massively used in the First World War. This increase in firepower also leads to armies needing more men, more guns, more ammunition, and so on. This could only be implemented if a nation had a powerful industry to fulfill these needs. There was also the option of importing the equipment you needed from other nations, but this would be costly and leave you at the mercy of other nations and their arms industry. This still makes it so only wealthy nations are able to field such armies. This increase in army size and firepower in Europe would lead to massive front lines defined by trench warfare and an end to the old ways wars were fought. This might seem like a bit of a ramble right now, but it will be important later in the video. If we look at the Paradox games that come before and after Victoria 3 in the timeline, we see two vastly different types of warfare. Before Victoria 3 comes Europa Universalis 4, which has a war system focused on individual battles and laying sieges to forts. Now, this is a fairly good representation of warfare in that period. Of course, in real life there could be fortified areas that aren't forts, or trenches could be dug around specific places that an army wished to defend more heavily. Trenches were also used to lay siege to enemy forts and castles back then, although this was vastly different from how trenches today are used to defend areas. But there was no widespread use of trenches or the creation of large front lines like as we saw in World War I. An interesting fact I learned in doing my research for this video: trenches prior to World War I were almost always above ground. Now, I won't go into the specifics here, but I will mention that this mostly changed in World War I because of the increase in firepower and collateral damage caused by artillery shells. If you wish to know more about this topic, I recommend this video about it made by the National World War I Museum and Memorial YouTube channel. I will put the link down in the description, so make sure to watch it after this one, of course. Next, we take a look at Hearts of Iron 4, which starts the year that Victoria 3 ends, 1936. The warfare in Hearts of Iron is representative of World War II, with large-scale front lines and basically a soldier on every inch of the front line. There were exceptions to this as well. A good example of this would be whenever there weren't enough troops to cover the front line, so officers would have to pick key points to put troops on, or retreat to a smaller front line where they could cover the entire line. Another good example would be whenever a breakthrough was made and either the front lines would fall apart or had to reshape to function properly again. Now, I don't want to dwell on these games too much, but they are important to mention to get to my point. That being that Victoria 3 takes place in the era that changes Europa Universalis warfare into Hearts of Iron warfare, which would be difficult to properly depict in-game. I think that is at least part of the reason for the current warfare system, which leaves the player with a rather low amount of control. Besides building barracks and setting certain generals with a certain amount of troops on a front line to either attack or defend, there isn't much the player can do to change the outcome. Alright, now that we have all of this information established, let's get into the next segment. So let's say they would want to change or fix the warfare mechanic in Victoria 3, and give the player roughly the same amount of management as in Europa Universalis or Hearts of Iron. How would this work? The way I see it, there are 4 possible ways they could go about this. I think we can all agree that Victoria 2 was a pretty good economic simulation, but its warfare department, although being like EU4, was a little out of place. It works fine at the start of the game, where warfare is more like we see in EU4, with infantry, cavalry and artillery being the 3 parts of an army, but once you start getting planes and tanks, it kind of doesn't make sense anymore. Fighting World War I with EU4 style mechanics just feels out of place. And still having to siege a place in World War I just doesn't make sense, as capturing a city, for example, is a wildly different process than capturing a walled-off fortress. This is why, in my opinion, using the Hearts of Iron 4 Great War mod is a better World War I experience than playing World War I in Victoria 2 or 3. Now, I will admit that Victoria 2 was made 6 years before Hearts of Iron 4 came out, and obviously they hadn't thought of making a frontline warfare mechanic yet. So this is in no way a critique on Victoria 2, I also enjoy that game, but playing it with current day knowledge does make the warfare feel out of place. For me at least. So I don't think this would be a good solution for Victoria 3, because although it does give the player more control, it would end up suffering from the same problems as Victoria 2 did. Okay, so what if we made all the warfare like in Hearts of Iron 4? This would solve the World War I being weird problem and give the player lots more control over the army. However, this would be a very inaccurate depiction of pretty much all the wars before World War I. So, while thinking of possible solutions, I actually thought that a Hearts of Iron 4 style war mechanic, with some changes, would actually be a good solution. I thought this because I was under the assumption that the Second Schleswig War and the Franco-Prussian War were fought with at least some form of front line and common use of trenches. This, however, was not the case. Both of these wars were actually fought by sieging forts and other defensive areas and with individual armies marching into individual battles or to individual sieges. As you can see here on this image of the Franco-Prussian War, they clearly show cities and key points having been sieged and arrows where individual armies march towards. So basically what a system like Hearts of Iron would end up doing is massively misrepresent warfare prior to World War I. And with World War I being rather late game in Victoria 3, since the game runs from 1836 to 1936, most of the wars you fight would probably be misrepresented. Now there is the case of alternate history that you create when playing the game. However, most of the time you won't really research trench warfare until at least around after 1900, so that would still end up being late game. This all meaning that this option is also off the table. This is probably the most ambitious solution I've come up with. Basically, this solution would have both systems in the game. You would start out the game with Europa Universalis style warfare, and at some point you would change into Hearts of Iron style warfare. Even though this would provide lots of control to the player, this would unfortunately have several issues as well, some of which I don't know how to solve. The first and most obvious problem would be at which point the switch would be made and what event or tech would trigger the change. Would every nation switch at once, or would it depend on a certain technology? If we do it through technology, the obvious tech to pick would probably be trench warfare in my opinion. But the biggest problem that comes from this is when two nations go to war, of which only one has made the switch to Hearts of Iron style, while the other one is still on Europa Universalis style. This would leave the one on the Europa Universalis style of warfare with pretty much no chance of effectively fighting back. So what if we take the second option of everyone switching at once? This would solve the problem of having nations that haven't invented the technology yet, having virtually no chance of fighting back. This, however, would be a bit weird. Remember when I talked about nations needing a powerful industry to back up a military capable of properly fighting a war with trenches and front lines? Well, now imagine you being a nation that is either lagging behind, or being a nation that doesn't have a powerful military industry. You're suddenly forced to field an army that uses a lot more than it did 1 month ago. Well, unless you have enough money to pay for and import all the goods, your army would be just as useless as in the first option. There are probably more options of implementing something like this. Maybe a war could change into trench warfare if there are at least 2 large armies on opposing sides that are capable of fighting a war like this. There is, however, a big underlying problem with this solution that no matter which option you end up picking, it would suffer from this problem. How would this be properly implemented from a developer's point of view? Like I said, I am no game developer, but doing something like this probably takes a lot of time and effort to properly implement in a way that leaves no big problems, or a huge unbalanced system that would make playing smaller nations almost impossible. So no matter how much I myself like this option and think it would be a cool and interesting way of representing the changing of warfare in the Victorian era, I don't believe it's a realistic solution and therefore very unlikely to ever be implemented. Out of the 4 options, this would probably be the most realistic one. Instead of implementing a whole new system, we could potentially just improve the current system. I haven't really got a groundbreaking improvement apart from the obvious stuff like more control over how much brigades a general has, more control over front lines and their size, and maybe being able to set an offensive arrow like in Hearts of Iron. More control over army compositions and different types of units could also enhance player freedom and control. These things would probably be improvements I could see happening. So although this would leave us with similar problems as we have right now, I do think this would at least appease players and improve the gameplay. I see it as very unlikely we will ever see a warfare system in Victoria 3 that wouldn't at least misrepresent some parts of Victorian era warfare. And if we do get a system that doesn't, it will probably be something we haven't seen before or something that would be rather unfair to smaller nations in terms of gameplay. The most likely option is probably that Paradox will find a way to improve the current system to appease players enough so we won't have to complain about it anymore. And after all, Victoria 3 is more about economics and diplomacy rather than warfare, so as long as that part is good, the game will probably be fine. I think that right now they might be better off with improving the flavor of the game, because after a few playthroughs the game kind of starts to feel repetitive, but that's a topic for another time. So what do you guys think? Do you have any better solutions than the ones I provided? Or maybe a way to improve the current system? Let me know in the comments and I'll make sure to read all of them. This video is also different from my regular content, so let me know if you liked it by subscribing and liking the video, or maybe leave a comment telling me I was wrong about a historical fact. I'm always up to learn new historical facts, so yeah. But that's it for now, thanks for watching, and howdo.
Okay, remember when I said it was the lowest standard of living? I'm on 3.7. People are dying on the streets. What am I doing? This is so fucked up. Like, I have no idea how to fix any of this at this point.